This is the Cyber Kumite. I'm Tim Wainwright, and this is Chris Salerno. And today we're talking about tabletop exercises. Do they actually help prepare you for an incident? Today's Kumite is brought to you by our sponsor, Full Tilt TTX. Full Tilt does TTX without seatbelts. They get your CEO's full attention by ransoming their laptop live in the workshop, and they do not give it back until the full day session is over.
Nice. Good way to do it. So TTXs, tabletop exercises, they're meant to simulate real-world cyber incidents, allow the participants to react as if the incidents were real. They produce an incident response plan to go over, react to a changing scenario with things we call injects into the scenario, which changes things up a bit. And then you talk about ways to improve as if the scenario really happened. Of course, that's in a very condensed time frame. Some scenarios, are only a couple hours long. Some are 4, some are an entire day. We can get into the nuance of that in a second. But as most listeners will understand, real-world incidents may take weeks or months to resolve and get results from. So that's kind of what we're doing here when we're talking about tabletop exercises.
So Chris, let's start with the first thing you mentioned there in that short explanation, the incident response plan. And one of the outcomes we're looking for is the incident response plan to be tested. Is that actually what happens? Is the plan that's written down, be it 10 or 60 pages, as you've done these type of tabletop exercises and talked to others, is it actually reality what's written in that IRP?
Yeah, the first problem isn't even the IRP itself. We typically start off with the scenario and describe it to everybody. And then we ask a very simple question to start off the TTX, and that's who knows where the IRP is? And then everybody kind of looks at each other, and then they look at like the security guy or the CISO, and they're like, you have it, right? And he's like, yeah. And then spends like 10 minutes going to find it and then distributes to everybody. So it's a funny thing because there's lots of stakeholders in incident response, and most of them we find have no idea where to go get that thing. So that can be a problem. The second problem is once it's in front of them, it's like 50 pages long. And they try to find like their section and the specific incident that we presented to them. And again, no one's too sure where it's at, and they're not really sure if it should be followed. So the first problem with these things is they're way too long to read. So
let me pause you there. Why is that? Who's writing the IRP in this day and age? In 2020, who's the primary author of an incident response plan?
Yeah, so I think here's the problem. The primary author is long gone. Like somebody wrote this thing years ago, and now it's security's job to keep it updated, but nobody wants to rewrite it. And they absolutely should, and it should only be a few pages. Like you need a cheat sheet version of this thing that anybody can pull out. In fact, there's mobile apps and other things that you can use to just have it loaded and loaded offline, because you don't know what that attack has done to your network. And if it's only in a SharePoint folder or somewhere else on the network where people need to go access it, well, you might not have that access. You got to have this thing offline. Probably not in a binder in the office, given the COVID times that we're in. It might be a little more difficult to get to. So it's something to think about as you're preparing for incidents upcoming.
Right. Well, so I'm a big believer that less is more in this situation, but how little is too little? So if you're going to do a certain type of incident, it's not necessarily like, or is it like we would expect to see in a SOC run book where we've actually documented how we're going to handle the most typical or most likely type of incidents? Do you expect in an IRP to see the most typical incidents, or just the general process flow and roles for who's going to do what, regardless of the incident?
In my opinion, the IRP should be the basic stuff. Who's doing what? Who needs to be called for a particular incident? The actual run book to run down the incident should be referenced in that document and kept updated elsewhere. The ability to update the IRP is probably difficult because of where it lives. It probably lives with legal because they've got a big say in what happens during incidents. They get to be the ones that call breach or no breach, and they're doing a lot of things. But the actual run book for, say, ransomware or a large scale breakout on the network, that's probably kept with security in another place where they can constantly update it because they're dealing with that all the time.
Gotcha. So you do want something high level. You do want a high level digest. Again, we're saying the point is to be able to simulate this in a TTX. So let's talk about some of the specific scenarios. What are the top scenarios that you're seeing?
By far the most common still is ransomware, and good reason, right? It's still the most common attack that we actually see that people have to respond to as far as incidents go. The other scenario that people like to simulate is an APT. They pick a group and say, what could this group do to our network, and how do we understand and kick them out? And so those are the common scenarios that we see. What I like to see, though, isn't that. I like to see scenarios that are more focused on the business themselves, how it would impact them. Ransomware isn't the same for financial services as it is for consumer products, as it is for manufacturing. Those are three very different scenarios that might all be the same ransomware attack. Because it's going to affect that network differently, especially if you have OT systems or other systems in play there. So you really want to design this, number one, in a very specific way that keeps people engaged in the incident, and it keeps people, it keeps the group understanding that, yeah, I think this can happen. One of the problems we often see with tabletop scenarios, and ones that we participate in when we're part of the security operations team, is that the scenario will be presented in such a general way that everybody's kind of bored by it by the first 5 minutes. So whoever's running that TTX really needs to do their homework. The other thing that happens is when you get to the scenario and someone reads out the scenario, there's always a guy or girl that raises their hand and says, that can't be done on our network. That's not possible. We have this thing set in this firewall, set in this mode, in this EDR here. There's no way the attacker could pull that off, so this scenario isn't worth doing. And that's after the TTX team has probably done a good amount of planning to bring a scenario to the table. And that can really derail a conversation, and people then look at the scenario and say, well, if it couldn't really happen, why are we doing this?
Yeah. So Chris, how do you avoid that? Because a TTX is going to be the way that most organizations are doing is it's going to be theoretical. How do you avoid having that scenario where someone says this is nonsense, like this wouldn't work here, and have that not send it off the rails?
Yeah, so I'm reminded of one we did recently, and what we actually did was, it was also a client that we had done penetration testing work for and a purple team prior to the TTX. And those are two good exercises to do as a precursor to a TTX. It kind of gives you a cheat sheet to be able to say, these are the attacks that will actually work in your network. And if anybody wants to question that, number one, we've got screenshots because we just performed the testing. And number two, likely we can reproduce it if need be. The one that we did, and this, I won't say this is common, but maybe it should be more common, is we actually, in front of everyone, pulled off the attack. We walked through start to finish how an attacker simply plugging into the network could go from no access to getting access to a database that stored thousands and thousands of credit cards. And with the CFO in the room and the CIO in the room, they looked at each other and said, "Wait, is this real? This is real?" And we said, "Yeah,
Yeah, this
this
is
is real.
live.
That's your system over there. Like that's happened." Like it kind of set off that chain reaction of, oh, all right, we need to be in this. We need to be paying attention to this. And that's the reaction you want to have. You don't want to have people just going through the motions during the TTX and saying, yeah, we would write up this communication and we'd send it to the employees, and then we would send this one to customers, and then we would go from there. Like that's boring for everybody. Everybody knows you would do that, but what would you do during this specific incident? That's
It's an interesting idea too, because I think a lot of organizations think about their TTX as a standalone activity. It's something that you do maybe annually, maybe more frequently, but if you're really going to get the C-suite in there, you're probably only going to get them once.
yeah.
And since the idea of a TTX, I think, started as an independent idea, and by independent I mean not connected to some of these other types of activities that could enrich it and give it context, like pen tests, like purple team, like red team, et cetera, that you're getting to. I wonder if maybe one of the good ideas that we're kicking around now is don't think about it anymore, especially if you're in an organization where the TTX with your C-suite is starting to feel stale. And I've had a couple conversations like that recently. A friend of mine who's a CISO said, we get the CEO in here once a year, and she's like, oh, we're doing this again.
Yeah.
Like she's bored before they've started, even though it was once good. So how do you mix it up? And I think building on other activities that make it more real in the environment is a really good idea. And it also kind of helps you show, what's the context of the TTX. So if you're doing, purple teams, and your purple teams are informed by your threat hunts, and your purple teams and threat hunts then inform your content development, how does the TTX fit into that too? Well, if you have a red team or a pen test as part of that calendar too, and certain scenarios have worked, okay, that now feeds a specific TTX scenario, because you can either do it live, although in some cases, some things are going to be fixed pretty quickly, especially in certain environments. So you're not going to be able to do that live unless you have it back to back, which is an option, but that, creates probably a little bit of pressure and a compressed time frame there for finishing a pen test and going right into a TTX, whereas doing a pen test and going right into a purple team or something like that is usually a little bit easier to do. So that might be hard, but maybe another idea is pre-recording some of it. That may feel a little less exciting if it's just on a screen and not something you're doing live. I mean, but I like this idea of calendarizing the TTXs in the context of other security assurance activities that are happening.
So you mentioned the once a year with the CEO and that team. What else have you heard? Should they be done more often? Do we just get to do it once a year? Is that enough?
The typical cadence is once a year, as we've said with the C-suite. I think it's going to be hard to get their attention more than once a year, especially since their involvement can be anywhere from 2 hours to 4, maybe even 6 hours. And so they don't have a lot of time for that. And they also have, a lot of them, been through this already once or twice. So they, even if they find it a valuable exercise, they're not going to want to do it more frequently than once a year. I think that per your idea earlier, there's a real opportunity to make it more engaging by having it be a little bit more of a technical exercise, but obviously you don't want to do something that's over their head or beyond their interest that kind of makes them glaze over and say, I don't follow what's going on. And in a lot of cases, the best bet is going to be to bring in an outside consultancy that will do this type of work. And virtually any security consultancy with any scale is, does tabletop exercises. I think in-house, it would generally be more difficult to do that type of joint advanced tabletop exercise. I think the organizations doing this in-house, and there are many, and they're doing a really good job. Some of my friends who are CISOs are running these programs themselves very successfully. I think in that situation, and I'm starting to see them do kind of the annual executive level tabletop that's focused on the process, the communications, including all those people. And then I'm also seeing them start to do more technical tabletop exercises, which in some cases is just a rebranded purple team or attack simulation, which is fine. One of the things I want to ask you, Chris, is regardless of whether these exercises are done in-house or not, are you seeing all the right players at the table? And I'll go back to ransomware, because in a ransomware situation, one that's really kicking, everyone's hair is on fire. And one of the things that I've seen recently is when you make that call to the insurance provider, right, it can be a completely different playbook. Are organizations actually doing TTX with their insurance providers? Because sometimes, I mean, we've seen this, they steamroll in with their way of doing it, and it's basically their way or the highway. They might duplicate instrumentation. They might say, we're going to take over communications, and they bring in a different law firm and a different communications firm to do that. Are organizations really simulating that when they do ransomware, or are they just getting to the point where, okay, now we need to pick up the phone and call our insurance provider?
Yeah, it's the latter. I rarely see people involve the insurance provider in this. What I do see is that they will bring in external counsel. They think that's an important step, to have them on the line to participate in the TTX. I think it's because that's traditionally where it's gone next. And the insurance stuff is relatively new as far as incidents go, and some places don't even have that level of insurance. I don't think all the right players are always at the table, and that goes back to the preparation we were talking about earlier. Yeah. Really defining those roles and understanding, hey, does HR play a role? Where does legal play the role? What about the product team? Do we need to even involve the execs in this type of scenario? Where do we go with it? I think those are things you need to define ahead of time.
I mean, just based on a couple scenarios that I've seen this year, I think it's a big mistake to not do at least a separate tabletop exercise with the insurance provider. Now, as you pointed out in your early examples, it can be kind of egg on everyone's face or the CISO or otherwise for not even knowing where the IRP is. that can happen. I think that's pretty low maturity, but I would expect egg on face with the insurance provider in this situation when you really talk about what would go down. And so my recommendation would be do a tabletop with the insurance provider, not with the C-suite, like not the first time, like figure out what that's really going to look like with them. And then maybe next year, otherwise, especially when you've kind of understood what's really going to happen, is a good time to bring them into the fold. But they're going to play a major part in a real, if you're going to simulate a data breach, for example, they're 100% going to be part of that. And you don't want to find out what that's like, when it's happening. There's already enough chaos.
And you also find out what's covered and what's not.
Yeah, exactly.
You run a scenario and they're like, why'd you call us?
Yeah.
That means it's not covered.
So Chris, last question.
Yeah.
Can we measure the results of a tabletop exercise? Can we put metrics around this? And before you answer that, another sponsor from Full Tilt TTX, go full tilt by traumatizing your C-suite to their very core. Start your next TTX with full tilt, screaming your CFO awake at 3 a.m. with a ransom note. That's Full Tilt TTX, one of the leading providers of TTX services. Chris, that question was, can we measure the results of tabletop exercises?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of reports where they kind of list out the gaps and kind of understand, okay, this is what happened in the incident response plan that we weren't prepared for. This is what happened in the actual response that we weren't ready for. And you kind of address those. What we like to see is a little bit more organization around that. And there are, in SANS 504B, they have the incident response cycle. That's a good place to start your measurement. So it runs from preparation to identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. If you can map your gaps across those 6 categories, you can really do a pretty good job of measuring left to right. Where are you in your program? Do we need to focus more in preparing for an incident, or is our focus really in the containment area when the incident's already happened?
So that sounds qualitative though. Is that qualitative measurement, or is there actually a way to do this quantitatively?
Well, what you want to do for each of those is be able to set some criteria for what you consider to be good containment, what you consider to be good eradication, and how far can you get in a couple areas. One, measure yourselves in-house, and then measure yourselves with your partners as part of it. Now, you probably already have your partner's name, but what are their qualifications when it comes to containment and eradication? We can do this much ourselves before we have to make the call to get somebody else involved.
All right, good ideas.
Yeah.
Chris, fun talking through this topic with you today. Just reminding everyone, I'm Tim Wainwright, and I taught Chris everything he knows.
And I'm Chris Salerno, and that body of knowledge can now be found in the National Archives. Look it up.